Behold, these really wondrous tortoises, with vast shells medallioned and orbed like shields. These mystic creatures affected me in a manner not easy to unfold. They seemed newly crawled forth from beneath the foundations of the world. In 1972, Lonesome George was taken from his home on Pinta Island. The last of his species of Galápagos tortoise, George was brought to a research station on a nearby island where he became famous for being alone, the endling. George belonged to one of at least 13 giant tortoise species, the world's largest, that used to live across the Galápagos. And they once numbered in the hundreds of thousands. So how did he end up lonesome? The answer, it turns out, has a lot more to do with geography than with the tortoises themselves. But the same forces that doomed some of those species might have ended up helping save others. Each of the major islands of the Galápagos host its own species of giant tortoise, except for the larger islands, which can have several spread out across different areas. As the island's dominant herbivores, weighing more than 220 kilograms, the tortoises are powerful ecosystem engineers, relied on by many other species to shape the landscape around them. And they largely fall into two broad categories. First, there's the domed tortoises with their dome-shaped shells. These tortoises tend to live up in the rugged highlands, grazing on the low vegetation that grows there. Then there's the saddleback tortoises. They have a raised front section of their shell that allows them to stretch their longer necks up to reach some of the higher vegetation that grows on the drier, low-lying islands. When their paths crossed with humans, both types were absolutely thriving, until a quirk of geography put them in the wrong place at the wrong time, or the wrong times. The first recorded arrival at the islands was an accident when the Bishop of Panama was blown off course in 1535. He described the islands as nothing but seals, turtles, and such big tortoises that each could carry a man on top of himself. In 1570, those big tortoises earned the islands their name, Insulae de los Galápagos, Islands of the Tortoise. The location of these islands soon became useful to ocean travelers. See, they sit right off the coast of Ecuador, not far from the west coast of South America. And by the 1600s, that west coast had become a busy trade route, making the Galápagos a convenient stopover for pirates who looted that trade route and needed a place to get away and regroup. When they visited the islands, the pirates began eating the tortoises, a great source of meat that was easy to catch, seeing as they were slow and pretty defenseless. And at the time, there seemed to be an almost endless number of them. But the tortoises' exploitation soon became more intense and systematic near the end of the 1700s, when a new group of sailors came to the islands, whalers. As they increasingly shifted their attention toward the Pacific, whalers found the islands well-placed. Because before the Panama Canal, the only way to get from the Atlantic into the Pacific was to sail around the tip of South America. From there, ships headed north, where they soon bumped into the Galápagos. For whalers spending long stretches at sea, needing somewhere to collect food and water, these islands quickly became just the place. And the tortoises had a biological quirk that made them especially useful on long journeys. They could survive for months without food or water. This meant that the tortoises could be brought onto the ships alive and kept until whenever the sailors wanted to eat them. So the whaling ships that began passing through in large numbers often loaded up on the giants. And there was a geographic pattern to which tortoises they were taking. The southernmost islands, like Hispaniola and Floriana, were the first ones the ships hit after rounding the tip of South America. So those islands were the ones sailors took from first. Also, the tortoises on those islands were saddlebacks. They were smaller, lighter, and living in low-lying areas near the coast, all factors that made them easy to find and easy to carry to the ship. The domed tortoises up in the highlands of the larger islands were bigger, difficult to carry out even with multiple people, and harder to reach, so they were more likely to be left alone. From Hispaniola, whalers in the 1830s took over 100 tortoises each year. But by the 1840s, that number dropped to under 45. And by the 1850s, they barely took any because there were so few left to take. The situation on Floriana was worse. By 1850, the species found there was gone entirely. The combination of biology and geography, smaller saddlebacks living in low-lying areas on one of the southernmost islands, had wiped the island clean. And even as the whalers began to destroy the tortoise populations, the Galápagos was only getting busier as a stopover. When the gold rush began in California in 1848, people flocked to the San Francisco area. San Francisco itself quickly exploded in size, going from a population of less than 1,000 people to more than 20,000. The majority of these newcomers were arriving by ship, using the same route as the whalers around the tip of South America. And they started stopping to pick up tortoises along the way. See, that new population needed to eat, so the tortoises suddenly became more than merely food for the crew. They became cargo, collected to sell in California, and throughout the 1850s, a stunning number were imported. Tortoise hauls only slowed down when the reason for sailing that route started to fizzle out. First, whale populations crashed, making whaling less profitable. Then petroleum was discovered in Pennsylvania, replacing whale oil. Additionally, the Civil War soon started pulling ships for the war effort, and the Transcontinental Railroad's completion meant travelers could get to California without sailing at all. But by then, an estimated 200,000 giant tortoises had been taken from the Galápagos. Tortoise numbers had decreased by roughly 90%, a problem made worse by the impacts of invasive species that people had introduced. At least 3 species of tortoise had disappeared entirely. While it's hard for any population to recover from such a dip, the tortoises were especially at a disadvantage. Tortoises live for a really long time, so everything in their timescale moves slowly. It takes 20 to 25 years for an individual to reach sexual maturity and be able to reproduce. So even just a few decades of heavy collecting meant the tortoises would need centuries to recover naturally, if there were any left to recover, that is. It wasn't until the 1930s that people became concerned about the tortoise populations and made it illegal to take the tortoises. And when conservation really got underway in the 1950s, the situation was dire. What these conservationists found as they set up a research station and surveyed the islands was a series of islands that were largely decimated, but not entirely, they'd soon learn. On the island of Pinta, for example, where tortoises were thought to be extinct since the early 20th century, a scientist spotted a lone tortoise. It was 1971, and the tortoise, soon named Lonesome George, was the focus of conservationists' breeding efforts for decades, trying to cross his species with other closely related ones. But nothing worked. George seemed largely uninterested in mating, and the one clutch that was laid by a female he was bred with turned up no viable eggs. He died on June 24, 2012, at over 100 years old. One tortoise clearly wasn't enough to save a species. But luckily, not every island had been reduced to just one. And these remaining tortoises raised a question. How much of a species do you actually need in order to save it? At the same time as researchers had been exploring Pinta in the 1970s, they were also looking at other islands, like Hispaniola, the southernmost one. There, they found that its saddleback species had been reduced to a tiny group, 12 females and only 2 males. And they'd set up an emergency breeding program at the research center for the Hispaniola tortoises when they realized that a 3rd male from Hispaniola had actually been quietly hanging out at the San Diego Zoo since the 1930s. Researchers called him Diego, and not long after Lonesome George was moved to the breeding center in 1977, Diego was also brought there. Unlike George, Diego turned out to be kind of a stud. Over the next few decades, the Hispaniola breeding program was pretty successful, but Diego really stood out, fathering roughly 40% of the program's offspring himself, around 800 to 900 tortoises. This helped Hispaniola tortoises rebound enough that, over time, 1,900 juveniles were repatriated back to their home island. And in 2020, Diego himself was retired and reintroduced back home to Hispaniola Island too. He was roughly 100 years old, and it had been almost 90 years since he last roamed those hills. So, with even a small group of survivors, a species could be saved. But not every species had 15 survivors, including a Diego. What about the ones that had no survivors left at all? Not long after George died in 2012, the world learned that his species story wasn't quite over. Just 6 months later, scientists announced that they had found something interesting on the archipelago's largest island, Isabella. They'd been analyzing the genomes of tortoises on Isabella's northern tip, a place called Wolf Volcano, and found 17 tortoises that carried pinta ancestry. 4 of those probably even had a purebred pinta parent. George's species, or at least part of it, was still out there, just on a volcano hundreds of kilometers away from their home. But how? Well, the answer goes back to the whalers. See, ships that accidentally collected too many tortoises would sometimes dump them on other islands on their way west out of the archipelago. And some of those tortoises that had been shuffled around survived, breeding with the local species on their new island homes and moving up to the more difficult-to-reach areas away from the coast. So, the same people who had driven George's species towards extinction had also accidentally scattered members of the species, leading to its partial survival. And whether this was enough to save a species became an increasingly urgent question as scientists realized pinta tortoises weren't the only genetic ghosts on Wolf Volcano. See, researchers had noticed a group of saddlebacks that didn't belong up there with the domed Highlanders. And when they tested their DNA, many of these saddlebacks matched with DNA from Floriana, the island where the first tortoise had supposedly gone extinct back in 1850. But how did researchers even know what Floriana DNA looked like if they had been gone for over 150 years? Well, even though they disappeared from Floriana, some ended up as museum specimens. And the DNA from those tortoises helped genetically identify these relatives of a seemingly long-lost group. Now, they weren't purebreds, they were hybrids, part Floriana tortoise, part Wolf Volcano giant tortoise. Once again, the whalers had accidentally shuffled tortoises between islands, where they bred with whatever was already there. And this seems to have happened a lot with Floriana tortoises. A 2015 expedition to Wolf Volcano uncovered 65 tortoises with Floriana ancestry, a stunning number from a species that was supposed to have been gone for over 160 years. So, more of this species was preserved in terms of genetic diversity than the lingering DNA of the pinta tortoises, but less, of course, than the purebreds of Diego's Espanola species. Was this enough to save the species? What does it mean when the best you can do is preserve some of its genetic material mixed in with something else? Is it enough? Some conservationists argue that it is, because a creature's ecological role is what matters. The giant tortoises that once roamed the Galápagos grazed, dispersed seeds, and trampled vegetation in a way that kept the habitat functioning. So, if a hybrid tortoise can do that same job, fill the same role in helping the ecosystem function, then the exact genetics are not a problem. But others aren't so sure, arguing that when a species is lost, something is lost along with it that can't be patched up by a close approximation. As we talked about in our episode on the Florida panther, there are no scientific definitions for deciding how many genes make up a species, or for that matter, how to define species at all. Researchers in the Galapagos aren't waiting for the debate to be settled, though, and they're working to preserve the genetic diversity that once made up these islands as best they can. Among the hybrid Floriana tortoises, the researchers selected 23 individuals with the highest Floriana ancestry and paired specific groupings of males and females to breed. Essentially, they're backbreeding to create something close to the original Floriana tortoises, maximizing the Floriana genetic material in each generation, just very, very slowly. Meanwhile, they've worked to restore the island itself, eradicating the rats and feral cats that had moved in after the tortoises disappeared, devastating the ecosystem. And in February of 2026, 158 captive-bred juveniles were released onto Floriana, the first giant tortoises to walk there in over 175 years. While they'll never be purebred Floriana tortoises, these hybrids are out there, roaming the island and reshaping the landscape. The story of the Galapagos tortoises overall is a story of loss, chance, and, in numerous cases, rediscovery. And it's a story that's still unfolding. In 2019, another lonesome tortoise was found on the archipelago's youngest island, a place called Fernandina. It had been almost 50 years after the remarkable sighting of Lonesome George, and Fernandina was thought to have been entirely without its original tortoises for well over a century, even longer than George's island of Pinta. But that lone tortoise's DNA, compared to the single other known Fernandina tortoise collected for a museum in 1906, confirmed that this individual was, in fact, a Fernandina tortoise. The researchers named her Fernanda, and unlike those hybrids and genetic ghosts, Fernanda was a purebred of her kind, but she was just one tortoise. And while George had reminded us that one member of a species is not enough to save it, her discovery gave researchers hope that there could be others roaming her island. Several years on, though, it's starting to look like Fernanda is, in fact, her species' endling. But it's hard to say for sure, because Fernandina is a jagged island that's difficult to survey. So it's possible one or more tortoises might still be there, just out of sight, concealed by the particular geography of their home. And if the Galapagos tortoises have taught us anything, it's that geography can both cause things to be lost, but also result in an occasional stroke of luck, helping preserve endlings and hybrids long after anyone expected. We'd like to thank the San Diego Zoo Wildlife Alliance and the Galápagos Conservancy for letting us use their images in this episode.